How's it going, you guys? So in this video, I wanted to discuss evidence for evolution. The evidence for evolution videos will be broken up into two. This is part one of the evidence for evolution videos, so stay tuned for part two. In part one, I wanted to discuss evidence for evolution from three different subfields of biology, or perhaps outside of biology to some degree. And then in the next video, part two, I will discuss the other three subfields of biology and their evidence for evolution. So mathematics, biogeography, and paleontology, those are the fields that I'll talk about today. Comparative anatomy, developmental biology, and molecular biology/genetics, that's going to be in part two, the part two video. So let's talk about mathematics first. We already discussed Hardy-Weinberg. So Hardy-Weinberg the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium states that organisms, if they meet a certain set of requirements, then they are not evolving, right? Now, typically none of those requirements are met. So with that in mind, we can use Hardy-Weinberg as kind of in the Hardy-Weinberg equations, as kind of a null hypothesis to state that the population is not evolving. And then when we get our actual data, and if we compare that to our mathematical data predicted by Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and if they're significantly different from each other, then we can state that the population is in fact evolving. So that would show mathematical data that a population does not meet Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, so it is in fact evolving. That's something that we already discussed. What I want to discuss in this video a little bit more is biogeography and paleontology. Biogeography is the study of life as it pertains to the geography, so the physical structures, the distribution of land, and so we'll talk about that. But paleontology is the study of fossils and the fossil record, so that is something we'll also discuss in this video. So let's talk about biogeography first. So I've drawn a map of the Earth, and so I'll talk about a couple of examples of how we can see how biogeography has shaped and serves as evidence for evolution. Quick review though, geography can be defined as the study of physical features of the Earth and its atmosphere, while biogeography can be defined as the study of geographical distribution of life. So that's what I want to focus on, is the geographical distribution of life, how life is distributed based on the geographical features in which the life is living. So let's show some examples. Maybe it'll make more sense with examples. So here we have a partial map of the Earth. We have Australia down here. We have Asia up here, Europe. We have Africa. North America and South America are not shown. They're over there. But for one example of biogeography and how it serves as evidence for evolution, we can look at mammals and the distribution of mammals throughout the world. So there are really two types of mammals. There are placental mammals, and then there are marsupial mammals. Marsupial mammals have the pouch, whereas placental mammals, like humans for instance, they develop internally and they have a placenta. So the Australian kangaroo, for instance, is a marsupial mammal. Now, kangaroos we only really find naturally in Australia. And if we think about it, let's say we were looking at Europe, we might see something like the European rabbit, but we wouldn't see any kangaroos up there. Now, it's interesting because the rabbit, the European rabbit, might thrive pretty well in Australia, and perhaps the kangaroo might thrive pretty well in parts where the European rabbit is found. However, they are kind of isolated, naturally speaking, to their specific parts of the world. So that right there is interesting because it kind of shows that if we consider this in the context of evolution, it would make sense that kangaroos and a lot of other marsupial mammals would have developed and grown only in the area in which they initially evolved, right, or they initially originated. Same thing with the rabbits. Now, I do believe, I'm not certain about this, I do believe that the European rabbit has become an invasive species within Australia, or at least some type of rabbit has become an invasive species within Australia. So that just goes to show you that the rabbit could have thrived in Australia. However, it is isolated to its own regions of the world. So that is one instance where we can see how organisms are in their specific places because they are biogeographically located in certain areas, which can be explained in the context of evolution, where they originated. Even if we look at things like the Wallace Line, so Alfred Wallace was someone who existed around the same time as Darwin, and I won't go into the story of Wallace and Darwin, but Wallace essentially came up with the idea of natural selection independently from Darwin, though Darwin gets a lot of the credit nowadays. But Wallace, he discovered, or he came up with this idea that he dubbed the Wallace Line. And the Wallace Line is basically this imaginary line, if you can think of it, that's drawn in between or dividing certain areas of the Malay archipelago. So on one side of the line, we see certain types of organisms, certain flora and certain fauna, flora being plant life and fauna being animal life. So for instance, we see a lot of marsupials, like the kangaroo, but other marsupials, other pouch organisms. And we see a lot of marsupials on this side of the line, but even on this side of the line, they are fairly close to each other, but we don't see marsupials, really. We see tigers and rhinos, for instance, so other types of organisms. So it turns out that if you looked at the Wallace Line from a geographical perspective, that area of the ocean, because this is divided by water, this area of the ocean is actually significantly deeper than some of the other areas of the ocean, which indicates that geographically speaking, or geologically speaking, these had a longer period of time where they were separated versus some of these other islands. So, in short, that means that there is more time for the marsupials to evolve independently from the, let's say, tigers and rhinos and the other flora or fauna on this side of the Wallace Line. So that's an example of biogeography evidence for evolution. We also talked about the Galapagos tortoises. So each of the tortoises living on their own island, even though they're very close together, have their own unique characteristics. And that allows locals to identify which tortoises were from which island just by looking at them. So for instance, if you look at Hood Island tortoises, they tend to have a longer neck, versus the Isabella Island tortoises have a shorter neck, but both of them happen to be significantly larger than, say, the tortoises found on the mainland, not too far away from the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador. So if we think about this from a biogeography perspective, the land on the Hood Island tends to be kind of sparse when it comes to vegetation. Vegetation tends to be higher up, which makes sense why this organism would have evolved with a longer neck, the Hood Island tortoise, whereas the Isabella Island tortoise has a shorter neck. And even more so, this organism here, this tortoise on the mainland, is small because there tends to be significantly more predators. Whereas there are fewer predators, maybe more on Isabella Island than Hood Island, but there are fewer predators out on the islands, so that has allowed the organisms, these particular tortoises, to get larger, right? So there we can kind of see that their geography, their isolation from each other, has allowed them to evolve to fit the needs of their island, to adapt to their specific environment. So all of this, these are just a few examples of how biogeography and data from that subfield of biogeography can be used as evidence for evolution. Now, I also wanted to discuss paleontology, because that serves as a pretty strong piece of evidence for evolution. So paleontology, if you're not familiar with it, is the study of fossils. Fossils are basically imprints or remains of organisms that have died in the past. And so we can use this to kind of piece together a fossil record to see the history of organisms. And what we see is that organisms that lived millions of years ago, billions of years ago, are different, morphologically speaking, than organisms that live around today. So, for instance, you wouldn't find human bones that existed hundreds of millions of years ago, right? But you might find like dinosaur bones 60 million years ago or beyond, hundreds of millions of years ago. So that kind of shows that organisms have changed over time. So some instances of, or examples of fossils could be bones, because when an organism dies, the soft tissue tends to break down a lot faster than hard tissue like bones, because bones have minerals like calcium that allow them to be a little more resilient to degradation over time. It also, I do want to point out that fossils, the conditions to get a fossil has to be just right. You need to be in an area that's very cold, an area that limits exposure or limits the organism's exposure to things that are going to break it down, such as certain types of bacteria. So bones are common fossils, and shells. Casts could be considered fossils. Casts aren't actual physical remains, but they are kind of an imprint of an old organism. I'll actually put some pictures over here. So I'll put bones here, I'll put casts here. I'll do some video editing to insert those in there. But a cast would be perhaps an imprint of a shell from an organism that once lived hundreds of billions of years or hundreds of millions of years ago. Footprints could be considered fossils, and that could also give us some idea of the, I guess, behavior patterns of certain organisms, perhaps. Same thing, caprolites. Caprolites are fossilized pieces of feces, so poop. And so caprolites could also give us an indication of an organism's behavior whenever they lived, however many millions of years ago. We could also sometimes, rarely, have entire organisms preserved, perhaps in ice, perhaps like insects in amber. If you ever watched Jurassic Park, they have an insect trapped in amber. So all of those are examples of fossils, and they can be used to put together a fossil record, a history of organisms as they have changed over time. And so the fossil record shows evolution. We also see transitional forms of fossils, which is kind of interesting. So I'll see if I can insert a picture right here, but there's this one fossil called Tiktaalik rose, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But that was a fossil that was considered one of the first amphibians, one of the first organisms that made the transition from water exclusively to water and land. But that shows an example of a transitional fossil that shows organisms that once lived in water and how they've kind of transitioned to organisms that now live on land, tetrapods. So that is the fossil record, and that kind of shows how fossils can be used as pretty strong evidence for evolution. Now, a question arises: how do we know how old a fossil is? How do we date fossils necessarily? So we will be discussing some of the ways that we date fossils. The biggest way is radiometric dating. So there are these things called isotopes, which you guys have heard of before. Isotopes are versions of an atom. Perhaps two isotopes could be the same atom, but one has more neutrons than the other one, but it's still considered, let's say, carbon. So isotopes exist in various forms, and there are such things as radioisotopes. Radioisotopes are unstable. They break down over time. They emit certain particles sometimes. So radioisotopes that exist in nature, if they get trapped and preserved inside of a fossil or surrounding a fossil, over time, they will naturally break down, or they will naturally, lose particles or gain particles, perhaps, to make themselves more stable. And they have each different isotope, radioisotope, has a different half-life, so we can use the half-life to predict how old a fossil is. So let me use an example. Carbon dating, for example, is a common way to figure out the age of organic material. or fossils such as bones that are the remains of organisms that have died in the past. So the carbon cycle, if you're familiar with that, the carbon cycle basically shows how carbon is constantly circulated and replaced within a living ecosystem. Within trees, they kind of take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they convert it into glucose through photosynthesis, and that sugar ultimately gets stored perhaps as starch, and that starch or sugar gets eaten up by animals. Those animals might be eaten by other animals. They break the carbs down, they release the carbon as CO2 by breathing it out, and then that gets kind of recirculated throughout the carbon cycle. So ultimately, because carbon is constantly being used and replaced and released and brought in to an organism's body, the amount of carbon 12 for instance versus carbon 14, whatever that ratio is in the atmosphere, that ratio will remain the same within the organism. That is until the organism dies and stops kind of circulating carbon throughout the carbon cycle. Now, carbon 14 is a radioisotope. It's radioactive, and it has a half-life, I believe, 5,000 something years. So it's half-life, and half-life, by the way, means that within, let's say, 5,000 years, if that's the half-life of carbon, within 5,000 years, that carbon 14 will disappear. It will be converted into a more stable atom. I believe it's nitrogen 14 for carbon 14. So it gets converted into a more stable atom over time. It's not getting replaced because the organism is dead, so it's not going to continue circulating carbon throughout the carbon cycle. And over time, we see carbon 12 increase in its relative amount, or the ratio of carbon 12 to carbon 14 will increase. Then, let's say we find this fossil, and we test to see how much carbon 14 is left. What is the ratio of carbon 14 to carbon 12? And we can use that ratio, compare it to the atmospheric ratio, and we can predict how old that fossil is with certain limitations. So carbon 14, because it has a half-life of only 5,000 something years, I believe we can only date back several tens of thousands of years to get accurate data. Beyond that, once all the carbon 14 has disappeared, we don't necessarily, we can't say for certain when the organism was alive. And that is where other types of dating come into play. So that is carbon dating, a type of radiometric dating. There are other types of radiometric dating that date radioisotopes that have longer half-lives, so we can look back further in history. So for instance, if we find a fossil that can't conclusively be dated with carbon dating, or perhaps it is a cast, so it's just an imprint, so it has no actual physical remains of the organism, depending on where that fossil is found, what stratum it's found. Strata are layers of the earth, and each stratum kind of is from a different era in certain areas. So a great place that we can see this, if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, they have tons and tons of strata that date back hundreds of millions of years. It's pretty incredible. But depending on the age of the strata, as determined by radiometric dating of perhaps other types of radioisotopes, the age of the strata will tell you the age of the fossil. So those are just some ways that we can date fossils, and through dating the fossils and taking all of our different fossils within the fossil record, we can kind of piece together a history of organisms that serves as evidence for evolution. So ultimately, those are three pieces: the mathematics with Hardy-Weinberg, the biogeography, and paleontology. Those are three fields that serve or have contain evidence for evolution. So in the part 2 video, we will discuss comparative anatomy, we will discuss developmental biology, and we'll discuss how molecular biology and genetics also serve as evidence for evolution. So I hope that was helpful, and stay tuned for part 2.